You've eaten cow, you've eaten chicken, pig, salmon, maybe even octopus, if you're feeling adventurous. You have never once, in your entire life, sat down to a plate of lion, not because it's illegal everywhere, not because you couldn't find it if you tried hard enough. Something else stops you before the thought even finishes forming. A flicker of resistance, a small, wordless no, arriving before your brain has produced a single argument to justify it. You've probably never asked why. The real answer isn't about taste. It isn't really about safety either. Not in the way you'd guess. The real answer is far stranger, and it's been sitting inside your body for close to 2 million years, waiting for a question exactly like this one. Here's what actually happens if you eat predator meat. And here's why your ancestors built an invisible fence around it long before anyone ever wrote a rule down on paper, or carved it into stone, or gave it a name. Start with a number, 10%. That's roughly how much energy survives every time it climbs one step up a food chain. A blade of grass captures sunlight and turns it into sugar. A rabbit eats the grass and keeps about a tenth of that energy for itself, the rest spent on breathing, moving, staying warm. A fox eats the rabbit and keeps a tenth of that. Climb high enough, and by the time you reach something like a lion, almost all of the original sunlight is gone, burned off as body heat. Hundreds of steps removed, spent chasing, fighting, surviving. Wasted, from a calories point of view, just staying alive. An ecologist named Raymond Lindeman mapped this out in the 1940s, studying a small lake in Minnesota, one feeding level at a time. He called it the trophic dynamic structure of an ecosystem, which is a complicated way of describing a very simple fact. Energy leaks out at every single step. You can call it the 10% rule. Either way, it means something brutal for anyone thinking about dinner. Predators are wildly expensive to build in the first place, and even more expensive to hunt down and eat. Picture what that meant for a hungry hominin 2 million years ago, standing on an open plain with a rumbling stomach and a short window of daylight. A herd of grazing animals nearby represents enormous, breathing, walking calories, muscle built almost directly from sunlight and grass. One short step up the chain. A lion represents almost nothing by comparison. Every pound of muscle on that lion's frame took 100 grazing animals' worth of energy just to exist, and catching it would burn still more, on top of an already terrible trade. Would you risk your life for a week, dodging claws and teeth, to hunt an animal with barely any meat worth eating once you finally did? Your ancestors wouldn't either. Not as a rule, not as a taboo written into law, simply as math that never once worked in their favor. Archaeologists digging through the oldest known butchery sites keep finding the same pattern over and over on every continent where early humans lived. Cut marks on the leg bones of antelope, cut marks on the ribs of ancient buffalo, almost never on the bones of anything that once hunted for a living. The evidence in the dirt tells the same story the math already predicted. Paleoanthropologist Henry Bunn spent years examining exactly these cut marks at ancient sites in East Africa, tracing which animals early hominins were actually butchering nearly 2 million years ago. Site after site turned up the same grazing animals: antelope, wildebeest, buffalo. Not one of these earliest butchery sites tells the story of a hominin risking everything for a mouthful of leopard. But energy was never the only problem. There was a second one, quieter and far more dangerous. You are what you eat isn't just a saying. It's closer to a biological law. When a plant-eating animal swallows a toxic plant, its liver filters most of that poison out before it ever reaches the muscle you'd eat. But when a predator eats that plant eater, whatever poison survived gets stored again, concentrated, passed one level higher, like a debt that never gets paid off, only inherited. Scientists call this process biomagnification, and the frightening part is that toxins don't get diluted as they move up a food chain. They stack. A lion isn't just muscle and bone. A lion is a lifetime of every toxin its prey ever managed to survive. Filtered and layered, one meal at a time, for years. You've actually seen this exact math play out in modern life without ever connecting it to a lion on a savanna. Pregnant women today are warned to limit swordfish, shark, and king mackerel specifically. Not tuna in general, but the big predatory fish sitting at the very top of the ocean's food chain. Mercury, released into the sea in tiny, almost invisible amounts, climbs the same ladder a lion's toxins climb, concentrating hardest in exactly the animals built to eat everything beneath them. A warning label at a modern seafood counter is running the same calculation your ancestors' bodies were writing into pure instinct. long before anyone had invented the word mercury, or the word toxin, or the word ecosystem. Writer and biologist Rachel Carson documented a version of this same climb decades ago, tracing how the pesticide DDT moved from insects into fish, and from fish into the eagles that ate them, growing more concentrated with every step. The eagles never touched a drop of DDT directly. They simply sat one trophic level too high, eating animals that had already done the concentrating for them. A lion, a shark, a poisoned eagle. Different centuries, different chemicals, the exact same ladder. Then there's a third problem, and it might be the ugliest one of all. Herbivores mostly carry parasites built for a herbivore's gut, adapted to a body very different from yours. Carnivores carry parasites built to survive inside another carnivore, which means those parasites are already adapted to thrive inside something built roughly like you. Trichinella, the parasite behind trichinosis, still shows up almost exclusively in carnivore and omnivore meat today. Bear, wild boar, cougar, almost never in cattle grazing quietly in a field, chewing grass under an ordinary sky. Think of it as a lock that already fits your door. A parasite adapted to a fellow meat-eater's body has already solved most of the problems it would face inside yours. Temperature, immune defenses, gut chemistry, all roughly familiar territory. A parasite adapted to a grazing animal's very different gut has far more adjusting left to do, and far less chance of succeeding once it gets there. Every predator you might hunt was, in a sense, pre-tested against a body built like your own, by every meal it ever ate before you found it. So a body that instinctively avoided predator meat wasn't being squeamish, and it wasn't being irrational either. It was running arithmetic, silently, generation after generation. Low energy return, high toxin load, high parasite risk. High physical danger just to catch the thing in the first place, long before the meal was even cooked. Every early human lineage that ignored that arithmetic simply didn't survive long enough to pass the habit on to anyone. Here's where most people get the story backward. The common assumption is that the taboo came first. Some ancient spiritual law, a god somewhere forbidding the eating of a fellow predator, morality dressed up afterward as religion. An anthropologist named Marvin Harris spent decades testing that assumption against real cultures on nearly every continent, and he kept finding the opposite pattern, again and again. He studied why Hindu communities in India refused to eat cows. He studied why Jewish and Islamic communities avoided pork. He studied why coastal cultures ate fish freely, while inland farming cultures often didn't touch it. Every single time, underneath the religious explanation everyone repeated out loud, sat a colder, more practical one that nobody talked about. A cow plowing a field for 20 years was worth vastly more alive than dead. A pig, in a hot, dry climate, competed directly with humans for the same water and the same food. A competition that could tip an entire village toward starvation in a bad year. Harris called this idea cultural materialism, the theory that sacred rules are usually a society's way of encoding a hard economic lesson so deeply, wrapped in ritual and consequence, that nobody ever has to relearn it the expensive way twice. The predator taboo fits the exact same shape, except it runs even deeper, because it never actually needed culture to exist in the first place. It's older than religion, older than language itself. It's written into the same gut-level flinch that makes a plate of lion feel wrong before you've consciously thought of a single reason why it should. Here's the twist, though. The taboo barely needed to exist as a deliberate survival strategy, because something better was already sitting right in front of your ancestors, waiting to be discovered. Roughly 2 million years ago, something changed in the hominin diet, and it wasn't predator meat, it was fire. A Harvard primatologist named Richard Wrangham has spent much of his career arguing that cooking, not hunting, was the true hinge point of human evolution. Cooked meat and cooked starches release far more usable energy than raw food because heat does part of the digesting for you before food even reaches your stomach. Wrangham points to something remarkable buried inside your own body as evidence. Your gut is unusually short and simple for a primate your size, and your brain is unusually large and expensive to run. Cooking, he argues, is what paid for that trade. It freed up energy that used to go toward grinding through raw food all day and handed that energy straight to your growing brain instead. A gram of brain tissue burns roughly 20 times the energy of a gram of muscle, just sitting there, doing nothing but existing. That kind of tissue is not cheap. And evolution does not hand out expensive upgrades for free. Something had to be sold off to pay for it. Wrangham's answer is the gut itself, shrunk down once cooking took over part of its job, freeing up the energy budget that built the very brain, now reading this sentence and turning it into a thought. A cooked herbivore, in that light, delivered enormous, reliable calories, already safer, already easier to chew, already stripped of many of the parasites raw meat carried in the first place. Why chase a dangerous, low-reward predator when a herd of grazing animals stood in the open, offering 10 times the energy for a fraction of the risk? And fire made every single bite of them even better than the last? The predator was simply never worth the fight. Not calorically, not biologically, not even close. Except the rule was never quite absolute, and the exceptions turn out to be almost more revealing than the rule itself. Arctic groups sometimes ate polar bear, historically, but only specific parts, and never the liver, which they somehow learned, long before anyone understood vitamin A, could poison a person outright from a single meal. Certain cultures ritually consumed a small piece of a killed predator, not as food exactly, but as ceremony. Eating the animal's strength symbolically, in portions far too small to matter nutritionally, wrapped in words and warnings passed down with total precision. Some traditions went further, treating the eating of a predator as something reserved almost entirely for warriors, hunters, or leaders, and only after surviving a genuinely dangerous kill. Not a meal for a hungry family on an ordinary evening. A rare event, marked, remembered, and hedged with rules about who was allowed to eat, which part, in what order, under whose supervision. That level of ceremony rarely surrounds food that is simply abundant and safe. It tends to surround food that is scarce, risky, or symbolically loaded, exactly the profile predator meat carried from the very beginning. Notice what both of those exceptions share. They're rare, they're careful, they're wrapped in ritual, warning, and exact instruction about which part, how much, and when, down to the smallest detail. That isn't the behavior of a species casually deciding predator meat is fine after all. That's the behavior of a species handling something it already knows is dangerous, building just enough tradition around it so nobody, generations later, ever forgets why. Which brings this whole story back to you, standing in a grocery store or scrolling a restaurant menu on a Friday night, feeling that small flicker of resistance at the thought of ordering something that once hunted for a living. You don't calculate trophic levels before choosing dinner. Nobody does. But somewhere underneath the conscious decision, an ancient piece of arithmetic is still quietly running in the background. The same arithmetic that once decided whether a hungry hominin lived long enough to have children of their own. Notice it the next time wild game gets described as gamey, that faint, musky taste that comes from an animal built on a harder, leaner, more predatory diet than anything raised in a pasture. Notice it in the price tag on anything labeled exotic meat, priced high, partly because so few animals will ever qualify, and partly because almost nobody has spent centuries figuring out how to raise them efficiently, the way cattle and chickens have been refined for thousands of years. Notice it in the strict hunting laws that protect apex predators, specifically, laws built around conservation today, but echoing an older, deeper sense that these particular animals were never meant to be a food source in the first place. Notice it, too, in the way entire cuisines have built themselves around a small, repeating handful of grazing animals: cow, pig, chicken, sheep, goat. While something like lion, tiger, or wolf has never once headlined a major food tradition anywhere on Earth, in any country, in any era, anyone has documented. Notice it, finally, in something almost nobody thinks to question. Big game hunters who legally kill an apex predator overwhelmingly keep the hide, the skull, the mounted head, not the meat. Or at least, not as the point of the hunt. Compare that to hunting a deer or an elk, where the meat is usually the entire reason for the trip, filling a freezer for the whole winter ahead. The trophy and the dinner rarely come from the same animal, and that split alone tells you almost everything about which animals your species has always treated as food, and which ones it has always treated as something else entirely. That flicker of resistance you feel isn't randomness, and it isn't simple squeamishness either. It's the 10% rule, still quietly running the numbers somewhere beneath conscious thought, still steering you toward the animals that were always the better trade, long after you stop needing to consciously know why. You've eaten cow, you've eaten chicken, pig, salmon, maybe even octopus if you're feeling adventurous. You will probably never eat lion, and it was never really a rule that stopped you. It was 2 million years of arithmetic, already run, already decided, quietly protecting you from a trade that was never worth making in the first place.